My name is Eric Fuhrer, and the title of my paper is The Syllabus as a Model of Kinship. So this whole panel derives from a gender studies course I taught this spring at the University of Notre Dame, titled Gender Justice and the Environment. I framed this class around broad theoretical questions, which enabled me to bring my expertise to the class, which is as a poet, while inviting the students to do the same. I urge students to think about what worlds and affects they observe, feel, and build in their lives as they read the class text, as well as when they went about their daily actions. And so I wanted them to think about their embodiment in this class as well. By tracking our observations and thought matrices, we were better equipped to think about what futures we want to make possible, as well as the webs of activity that will lead us toward these imagined landscapes and realms of being with one another in ways that prioritize kinship networks that engender worlds which make room for what Donna Haraway terms, in When Species Meet, queer messmates. Both those that are, as she terms, hitching a ride, and those that we intentionally invite along. In this presentation, as in my class, I follow into the precariousness of networks that don't always mesh, quite often chafe, but always engender. I encourage my students to embark into precarity by allowing their minds to crawl and scatter in whatever way made most sense to them. I wanted them to shape something that did not exist as only an end product of the class, but that had legs, could swarm into new ideas and projects. I wanted their projects to be encounters with the class, as well as roadmaps for future encounters. To prepare them for such work during class, I had them sign up twice to pose questions on a class text. These questions were meant to open up discussion as much as possible and allowed each student to dive deeper into specific text that they found particularly helpful to think with. We also had a class dictionary that students were responsible for adding entries to, so that any new difficult terms could be defined and thought through, and then therefore there was some grounding provided for the discussions because we had those difficult definitions already defined for us that we could kind of move off of. At the beginning of each class, students would journal about a specific prompt that I would provide them. These journals were never collected because their function was to allow students' minds to work in the way they needed to work in order to process information. As someone whose initial notational systems often look like code to anybody else, and even my later notational systems too, I feel that collecting notes indirectly ends up prescribing a way of note-taking. And it has students thinking about assessments, which is something no one should have to worry about when they're just kind of spilling their thoughts onto the page. So instead, I had students at the midterm and final write a reflection on how the journal writing helped them generate thought, as well as questions and confusions, and I assessed them on this reflection. I had two major assignments in the class. One was an ethnography assignment, another one was a creative indexing. I structured the assignments in this class after Lauren Berlant and Kathleen Stewart's The Hundreds. I can't express enough how life-changing this book has been for me, and how much I'm honored to have met both Lauren and Kathleen at a 3CT event in Chicago in 2018. I was very sorry to hear of Lauren's recent passing, as their work has been very influential on my own thought, and I know was very much appreciated and even adored by many of the students in this class. There were few students who actually used the word love to describe their experience with the Hundreds. This is also true for a couple other texts too, particularly Patricia Smith's Blood Dazzler and Tommy Pico's Nature poem. It is so wonderful to hear students describe their encounter with a text as love, as we are taught so often to analyze, critique, but rarely to love the objects and subjects we study. I often feel myself like I am in a relationship with the media and texts that are closest to me, as if they are my kin. It is always an objective of mine when I teach to have students develop intellectual and affectual kinships with the material and with one another, And the assignments that the hundreds inspired really allowed for this objective to be met in the class. So the title of this book represents the collection of 100 ethnographic observations of 100 words each, but it also, for me, captures the multiplicity of new academic horizons afforded by the fusing of creative and critical, as well as by framing storytelling as not only research method, but research product. In The Mushroom at the End of the World, Anna Singh cautions us to think outside human notions of progress that have pressed all worlds, both human and non-human, into precarity. She argues that it is the human focus on progress that allows certain humans to not recognize their own precarity. She writes that, quote, only an appreciation of current precarity as an earthwide condition allows us to notice this, the situation of our world. As long as authoritative analysis requires assumptions of growth, experts don't see the heterogeneity of space and time, even where it is obvious to ordinary participants and observers. The practice of creating these ethnographic observations forces the writer to slow down and to process the slowness of a world that often blurs by us. In doing so, we cultivate a relationship with the way we frame these moments, as well as what this says about how we are observing and interpreting what we see. And for me and my class, it was in particularly in relation to class themes. So examining the thing we are observing deeply helps us to learn not only about this thing itself, but about its relationship to the rest of the world in a way that invites us to think more in roots and networks than the linearity of progressive time. So now I'm going to share a few ethnographies from my students with you. So basically there was an ethnographic assignment, and each student had to write 4 100-word ethnographies. So in her piece, The Irony, my student Lydia, who's on the panel with me, interrupts linearity by placing 2 time periods and narratives alongside one another, resulting in a question that invites us to think not only about the positionality of the young girl in a narrative, but also about ourselves. So this is Lydia. Somewhere in the world, a young girl woke up thinking about the 3-mile trek she is going to have to take to bring water to her family before leaving for school. Somewhere in the world, another girl has deemed it necessary to take a 30-minute long shower in the morning. Somewhere in the world, a girl carries a yellow jerrycan on her back. Somewhere in the world, another girl has a $200 backpack on. Does privilege corrupt character? If it doesn't, how can one who survived miles of walking to get clean water decide to keep the water running daily for half an hour? Asking for a friend. Lydia's ethnography ripens at the end. Rather than providing a tidy thesis, the short ethnographic form allows for meditative reflection on both the piece itself and the way the piece asks us to interact with ideas of space, privilege, and conservation. So instead of providing us some kind of prescriptive thesis, right, or some kind of, not the thesis had to be prescriptive, but some kind of like argument, she's letting us live in the piece with her, which is really beautiful, I think, and it's what these ethnographies kind of allow for. Again, slowing down, allowing the listener and the reader to slow down too. Another student, Paige, explores the precarity of environmental activism through the narrative of a local beekeeper in her piece, Buzz. I am also including her list of things she thought with, which Berlant and Stewart also included in their ethnographies to signify what, academic or not, helped them build each particular observation. So this is Paige. My friend Haley worked for a failing beekeeper, John. John moved the bees far away, but not far enough. The hive flooded, and the bees drowned, and John ordered more. John single-handedly runs a community garden in an impoverished urban area. His work is important, his intentions are earnest, and still his execution falls short. And it's a still page. What I thought with. A meme from junior year of high school. A sticker on my laptop. A med school graduate named John. A summer of grass stains and sweat and straw hats. A theology class I didn't do the reading for. The need for individual action. The needlessness of individual action. Interspecies connection and how badly we need it. Page's narrative is a great example of precarity and the difficulty of balance in a world that has been thrown off balance by anthropogenic environmental destruction. I am also interested in the capaciousness of the things she thought with, and also by the deeply personal nature of these items. How, even though she was not the beekeeper, her narrative is deeply entwined with that of the bees, as are all of our narratives, really. The final ethnography I want to share is from a student, Katie, who interviewed her former professor, Julia Thomas, for her observation, Loving Natural Phenomenon, resulting in a narrative of non-human love and, expectedly, normative human backlash. This is Katie. She recounted presenting her research at a conference in Japan and how volcanoes and tsunamis are events people live with. She concluded with the thought that we need to learn to love volcanoes, to which an older man exclaimed, "Well, young lady, we all know that comment makes no sense because you can't love something that doesn't love you back." This is Katie again. Yet it is perfectly possible to love something that doesn't love you back. You love chocolate ice cream, people, landscapes. The only perfect reciprocal love is the love of the narcissist. Anyways, you don't refer to someone with a PhD as young lady. Katie's underscoring of how love has become such a common term for expressing desire or satisfaction, yet still people have a problem thinking about it outside of normal normative structures and human structures, is convincing and reminiscent of Jerome Cohen's book Stone, in which he emphasizes our always present love for stone and the non-human. This is Cohen, some of our earliest art consists simply of a hand pressed against a rock, a desire for stone's persistence, a ritualistically repeated act of love. So Katie and Cohen both underscore that there is this connection, but for some reason, people like the male in the ethnography can't recognize anything beyond the human in terms of emotions or love. So thinking through these ethnographies lately made me reflect on my own relationship to slowness, even though I'm talking very quickly right now. So the other day I walked through my backyard gate and into a spider web that clung to my neck. For a moment I glistened with this prosthetic, yet I quickly wiped it away, hoping that legs had not vectored onto my body in a scattered motion. You see, I am terrified of things small and fast. Pet birds, wasps, spit released from the mouth of an animated speaker. I like my encounters to be slow. My dog, Boops, pressing his face on mine in the morning. A deer and I quietly assessing each other in the crisp of brush as I walk through the woods between the St. Joseph River and the passing cars above. In my voice memos app of this encounter, the only remnant of my encounter with the deer is the bright "oh" upon seeing it and my softening of breath as I stood there. I prefer multi-species encounters that produce a very clear and pleasant affect for me. The ones that allow me to experience a connection and then move back into mine. The spider web, like actual physical spider web of affect, is too unpredictable for me. Even though, as Haraway asserts, I am very much networked into this valence of being, whether I want to be or not. For example, there are literally bacteria on my face, on our faces, on your face, as I'm speaking right now. But I don't feel them. So I can live in the ignorance that I can't afford when a cockroach crawls up my arm thinking I am a surface. Aside, I used to share an apartment with a swarm of cockroaches and a roommate who thought it was funny that they made me uncomfortable. He shared his next apartment with moths, cockroaches, worms, mold, I'm sure much more, arguing with a snort that it was illogical that I willingly invited dogs into my house but not other creatures. There is an interesting argument somewhere here about who and what we choose to frame as welcome and as unwelcome, and even killable in certain situations. Haraway makes the argument that it should not be thou shalt not kill, but thou shalt not make killable. Yet I wonder what the word killable means in the sense of cockroaches, in the sense of viruses like the coronavirus. Surely we are not eradicating either, but we don't want to live among them, alongside them, or allow them to incubate within us. Our bodies plus a virus equal death in some circumstances. So we are choosing to disrupt their hosting, their networks of life in order to maintain our own. Cockroaches will tolerate in basements, maybe, maybe not, somewhere, just not by us. So the final project for the class was a creative index. The project was based off of the indexes at the end of the hundreds, which upend the traditional index form, i.e. Foucault, page 42, 44, 97, etc., in exchange for a more expansive index that collects items and ideas both within and beyond the text that the experience of reading personally pointed toward. So if a text reminds you of my dog goes in the creative index. Instead of having students create an index for a specific text, I had them create an index for the entire class. I framed this index as kinship making, opening it up to spiderwebbing and rabbit holes and outfoxing normatively academic trails that I usually knit into an artifact of knowledge in the form of a research paper. The index was not to be fixed, but fragment, part of, part with, and unfolding. The index assignment was meant to release the pressure, again placing more emphasis on process rather than product. The texts we read were quite difficult, and they tended to open up more thoughts and questions than they ever answered. I really wanted students to think about what this did to their brains. A version of a 1990s anti-drug campaign, this is your brain on drugs, although not drugs, but theory, and not a warning, but an invitation. This is your brain on theory. What does it look like? Research papers as end products of a class always seem to me to rush ideas. But this would allow those ideas to just kind of be placed open. And almost like we're seeing the veins of our thinking, as gross as that might sound when I say it out loud. So in an interview that Stacey Abrams recently conducted with Sarah Michelle Gellar, Abrams asserted the importance of storytelling, especially in policymaking. Abrams says, it's not just about where we are, it's making sure you understand the backstory, how we got here, but also that you can imagine what the world would be like if we got it done. And my responsibility is to create such a vivid picture of this that you feel like you could write it yourself. End quote. So, though I wholeheartedly agree, I often worry that in a rush to build a future, we don't fully observe and imagine the present. And with that, often don't see who or what the futures we are creating may be lacking or even harming or leaving behind. I'm not saying that Abrams is doing this herself, but that others who are less careful than her may be. As my student Elsa points out in her index, she's also on this panel, climate mitigation can easily become a bad word when it means investing in programs geared towards tourists while the local community remains consistently left behind. This continues to beg the question, which is vital to Abrams' work: whose stories are told via policy? It also emphasizes policy as an act of storytelling. Further in her index, Elsa thinks alongside Smith's Blood Dazzler to investigate the power his stories can have. This is Elsa. While in some ways, Katrina was a disaster like no other, in many other ways it was a story told time and time again about those who have been abandoned to face the rising waters around the world. For those who share the same story that is constantly reinvented and retold, time is cyclical. However, that also means there is a constant hope of rebirth. Unquote. So for the story to be retongued, it depends on who tells the story and what futures the storyteller is imagining. So I'll end by saying I was lucky to have the opportunity to teach a class full of storytellers this semester. They might not have all identified this way at first, and they might still not, as most came from the business school or political science or STEM fields. But their ethnographies and indexes proved, at least to me, otherwise, that they are storytellers. Their stories made me think differently, more slowly, and more comprehensively. They taught me grace and justice. I really hope I taught them as much. Thank you.